Warning. Warning. The following broadcast is not approved by your teacher, university, politician, or government. Side effects may include skepticism, better reasoning skills, liberty, peace, and an escape from the woke.
Welcome to the show. I am your host, LB Moniz, and this is the Been Awake podcast for better sense making. Episode 88. Do me a favor right now, wherever you're listening to this, okay? If you're listening to this live, thanks so much. We do this show live. Best way to find out when I go live is to follow me on X. Follow me on Twitter. That tends to be where I put it out. I do like doing these things live. It's always a lot of fun. Just do it live. Couple hours. We chop it up into segments for you people. Get home. Premium people get the whole list. That's the way we're working things right now. Getting used to StreamYard. I switched over to StreamYard because, hey, it's supposed to be nice and work well and streams me everywhere. So, hey, we're giving that a shot. So if you're listening to this, if you're watching this, thank you. You can find this on Rumble, on YouTube. You can find this on Twitter Spaces. Also, just Twitter for the whole video portion of it as well. So let's get into it. What's today's episode about? I don't know that I have an overarching theme yet for this episode, and I don't know that I care as much about that as I did in the past. This is what we do on the show is we kind of catch up over the last few weeks. I try to do at least one of these live streams a month, and we talk about important stories that happen in the news cycle, and we take a look at them from a slightly different angle. We analyze them. We do a meta-analysis, right? You know, it would be great, and I do hope one day to maybe be able to do something like this daily where you kind of get to pick up everything, right? And everything is kind of part of the game, and you know, you kind of do the drive-by that becomes so popular that people really, really enjoy. But this show has a little bit slower of a pace, right? It's not even a weekly show, it's a monthly show. So it takes a little bit of time for us to build up to some very important, I would argue, observations about things. And that's the point of this project, the project of better sense making. That's the idea behind Been Awake, because this myself and I guess let's just kind of get started with this. I've tried to put a few more thoughts down compared to what I had done in the past. So yeah, welcome to the show. This will probably be my last live stream of the year. We might get one more in before the new year, but this might be the last one. And so I wanted to take a little bit of time at this episode just to talk about what it's been like over these last doing this project, you know, creating beenawake.com, creating the content that I have. And there's a lot of content for you still at beenawake.com. There's plenty of articles you can read. There's an article that we're going to go over that I wrote today. But I've said multiple times that 2020 will be one of those years that is ingrained into a generation's mind, right? Where were you on 9/11? Where were you when Kennedy was shot? Where were you when the governor told you that you were locked down and you found out whether or not you were an essential worker? 2020 changed a lot of things in relation to politics. Of course, you could say people who think that 2016 changed with Trump are correct, but really we started to notice things in 2020 and really, in regards to the pandemic. I think that it's been a whirlwind of political change, and I think that thousands, if not millions, of us started to look around for better answers when we saw that the people in charge were lying. Right? If you were one of those people like me who didn't have the luxury of sitting home for 6 to 8 months at end and not do anything, right? If you were deemed an essential worker and so you had to go out there and do your job even though nothing was running. And if you were somebody like me who had to go to different states, you started to notice that nothing that was happening really made any kind of sense. And in some respects, that should be expected when a major catastrophe happens across the world, right? I think it's fair enough to say that there would be differing responses. And that's one thing, right? It's one thing to say that there's going to be differing responses to a crisis, especially in a system such as ours. But the difference for me and the difference that I really noticed as somebody who walked into the pandemic having built having built up for years a healthy skepticism of government action and its role in our lives, of somebody who was brought up to believe in the power of free markets, in the power of capitalism over communism. Suddenly I saw that system that I thought was unbreakable be allowed to grind to a halt and change forever. And there were the weirdest things that you noticed, right? Like McDonald's was open, but the local Mexican restaurant had to close. Say what you will, but really, what's the difference between those two? And in fact, couldn't it be argued that a mom and pop restaurant is serving better food than a multinational corporation like McDonald's? In part, that can be answered because McDonald's has lobbying power, I suppose. But it just goes to show some of the weird things that were happening. And again, as somebody who walked into the pandemic already having that skepticism of government, I wanted to point it out to people in my life and say, hey, have you noticed that a lot of the things that I had been saying, a lot of the things that libertarians had been saying broadly about the problems of government overreach, have you noticed that some of these things are starting to actually come true? What we witnessed was what was warned about of what government overreach could look like. But in reaction to that, America, the land of the free, didn't throw off the shackles of oppression. No, in fact, people cheered. People lined the streets, people begged to be locked down. Now, of course, we can mitigate some of this. It's not just that things were locked down, it's that people were primed to believe the institutions. And so I certainly learned more about how culture operates, and I realized that my frame for interpreting the world was not as sophisticated as I thought it was. See, I thought that by embracing a methodological individualism, we can better understand the world. And certainly it gives you a leg up over a lot of people to a point, right? Nothing about what we talk about on this show is in terms of absolutes. And that's not because that's what the Sith deal in. It's because absolutism, I think in part, roll with me here because I'm not sure we're going to stick with this definition, but absolutism does have something to do with this problem of leftism, with this problem of chaos. I've asked you to picture in your mind, if you've never been behind a soundboard, if you've never been involved in music, this might be difficult, but surely you've walked by the soundboard at a concert you might have gone to, or at a bar you might frequent, or you've watched a music video of people in the recording booth, And, you see all the little dials, and all those little dials adjust the frequencies, which give you a better output for raw sound. What we're trying to do here is to tune that picture of reality for you so that it makes sense. And most of what we deal with in terms of political speech is this grand, over the top presentation of facts that are meant to charge an emotional reaction. And in particular, in that we discuss ideas like leftism and the egalitarian delusion here, it's also taking those things and running them at 150%, even though it can only go to 100. Right? Leftism is chaos. It is no limits in a bad way. Everything has to have a limit. Our being is limited by the fact that we die. We do not live forever. Not in this corporeal form at the very least. So this impulse that we deal with today, and we're going to kind of talk about that. This impulse caused people to basically shatter the last remnants of the Bill of Rights in the United States. As much as I might think the Constitution as it was conceived is a good document, I can't in good faith pretend that it operates fully today. Maybe that would be an interesting thing for us to do on the show one time, is to go through the Bill of Rights and talk about how these things have been infringed. And certainly we're going to talk about it today in terms of free speech as we get into some of these topics. But not only did millions of people not care about the final erosion of the Bill of Rights, they rushed to the government's defense. They rushed to the social media companies' defense and said, hey, we don't want this. We don't want people to speak their minds. We don't want to have to do the work of sorting through which expert we should listen to. You guys should tell us who to listen to. And in fact, that's what many people did. Many people turned to where they thought they should listen to. And it turns out those people were the ones that potentially, had something to do with it. And so many of us sat here watching this happen and said, how? How could this happen? So it's changed me. It's changed the way that I look at politics and society. It's changed the way I think. It's changed the degree to which I think any of us can actually have an effect on the current political system. And I want to make sure we always keep that in mind as we walk through these stories together. Because so much of the ecosystem for media consumption, especially around politics, doesn't tell you that. They give you this false hope that a lot of things are going to change and that everything is going to snap back and go back to the way it was. And I'm here to tell you that can't happen. What we're here to do on this show is identify trends and figure out the best way to survive what's coming around the bend. No more, no less. That's what we have to deal with on this show. So let's start, if you would be so kind as to indulge me. We're going to start with an article I wrote at beenawake.com, where and as you can kind of see from the thing here as I pull up this article, the headline reads, "Dear Patriot, you're supposed to be demoralized." This is going to give us give you a better idea of what I'm trying to say in these conversations. The breakout of war, yet again in the Holy Land, has further shaken an already destabilized world. Only 3 years removed from a pandemic where we bore witness to political elites forcing businesses to close, unless you were McDonald's, turn normal human interaction into a moral taboo, unless you were invited to Obama's birthday party or something, and ran a medical experiment at an unprecedented scale. Those are the things that we witnessed. We witnessed a massive medical experiment at an unprecedented scale. You can quibble over the words if you want, but here we're here on the show to establish a narrative. And then, when the average person could no longer ignore that what was done was neither safe nor effective, there came a war. See, there's nothing, historically speaking, there's nothing like a good war to unite a people. And certainly, the leaders in politics, media, and culture transferred all their energy into convincing the American people the most important thing for taxpayer dollars was and is to fund a proxy war against Russia. As I said on Been Awake with LB at the time, this conflict was preventable, but simultaneously, it was in line with the goals envisioned of a deranged political class who wasted one of the greatest moments in modern history, aka the fall of communism, and refused to accept any change to the world as it exists. Let's remind ourselves the borders a government defends are its external borders. And from this, we understand the elites in Washington, D.C. do not have a care for the rising migrant crisis, but instead want to fund an ethnic conflict against one of the only countries on earth who could wipe every major U.S. city off the map. A patriot would understand from this that peace is the better path, but not the progressive world order funding politicians. We stand now almost 2 years into the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, and almost nothing has changed. And the mission has not been accomplished. And it's important we remember what that mission is. See, there are many levels to a complicated story, many, many levels that we should all pay attention to. One of those is that this is a war for democracy, right? That's often what's talked about, that this is a war for democracy, for the very soul of democratic governments. I've talked multiple times on this show how a theme throughout the Biden administration has been this juxtaposition of functioning liberal democracies and authoritarian dictators. Now, if you've been listening to this show for a long time, you'll know that I'm a little wary of the word dictator, because I've realized that the word dictator says a lot more emotionally than it does descriptively. And to translate it very simply for you here today, a dictator basically means a world leader that the US government doesn't like. Certainly from the perspective of our conversation here today. This is not to say there aren't dictatorial leaders across the world, that there aren't leaders who do bad things to their people. In fact, such is the nature of most governments. But it is to say that we should be careful when we use such imprecise terms in our political rhetoric. And you need to understand, as you consume the media landscape, that these words are used to manipulate you at a fundamental level. See, that's what skepticism provides us, as a constant check against our biases. So what has been and continues to be the mission in the Ukraine-Russia conflict? It's not to save democracy, because if we were interested in saving democracy, we might be pushing Zelensky to, I don't know, hold elections or not arrest priests and nuns and not ban political opposition parties and not bring all the media under the control of the government. If we were really concerned about a free and open democracy, we might talk about those things, but we don't. We talk about how Ukraine is defending democracy against the authoritarian horde, aka the Russians, aka the Soviets, aka those people who, for a large portion of the country, were bred and brought up to despise for many, many years. And of course, that it was reinforced during the whole Russia, Russia, Russia narrative in the Trump administration. But none of that answers what the mission is in Ukraine for the United States, because there is a stated mission. And if you've listened carefully to some politicians, you would have noticed it by now. If you listen to the show, you would know it as well, because we covered it. I know for a fact. The mission, the stated mission for the military, is to degrade the capacity of the Russians to fight a future conflict. It has nothing to do with a traditional victory and everything to do with this esoteric notion that by funding sectarian, basically, intra-ethnic conflict in an area whose borders have never been well defined, historically speaking, these are just facts, that it's better to do that in the hopes that our stated enemy, right, the stated enemy of the United States government, Russia, would lose their capacity to project their influence. And what's been the results of that? What's actually been the results of this? The results of this is the Russian economy hasn't suffered. In some respects, it's stronger. And in that it's been separated from the US hegemony, if you will, they've actually been able to reassert themselves. And if memory serves, the ruble is stronger today than it was in the past. At least it's stronger 1 year, 1.5 year into the conflict than it was at the beginning of it. So the mission has been a total failure. But that has been the stated mission of our government. While surely there are Russians who oppose the conflict, the Russian economy has not suffered in the way our political class predicted. And even top Ukrainian officials have begun to doubt their fearless comedian turned president. So what have our leaders done as the projection of US strength weakens and the American people notice everything is more expensive as we send billions more to one side of an Eastern European conflict? They double down on war. The successful terror attack of Hamas on November 7th, 2023 is still not fully understood, nor will it be understood for many years. There is never, you need to understand this, there is never an incentive in war to tell the truth. And while there are some journalists still left in this world, most who claim the title are propagandists searching for facts that justify their pre-existing narrative structure. Because what we understand on this show is that we're, in many respects, narrative-driven creatures. Which is to say, once we have a story, we look around the world and we put the facts in place to make sure that the story we tell ourselves makes sense. Story of what the world looks like, our place in it, and, you know, in many respects, our society's place, our place in society and our society's place in the world. So a lot of people call themselves journalists, but really they're propagandists. That's all they are. Maybe a lot of them put out propaganda I agree with. Maybe a lot of them put out propaganda I don't agree with. But that doesn't change the fact that that's a lot of what actually passes for journalism, especially the closer you get to major centers like cable news and places like that. Such is the way of things. History is written by the victors, after all. In the Ukraine-Russia conflict, only one side was considered acceptable to support. If you oppose the billions in aid sent to the Ukrainian government, you were an agent of the Kremlin. In the Israel-Palestinian conflict, however, there is, interesting enough, room to support both sides. While most senior politicians are closely aligned behind our closest ally, Israel, end quote, there are sizable dissenters on the left and the right who boldly, in many cases, support the Palestinian people, and even some who will vocally support Hamas itself. I've already attempted to lay out the complicated history and ideology in episode 87. I encourage you to go listen to it. But suffice it to say, while most have felt comfortable joining one team versus the other, the rest of us are left in a position of uncomfortable apathy. See, there's a certain, a lot of people talk about the binary, right? A lot of people will talk about political binaries and just the natural tendency for the human brain towards binaries. And they'll talk about it in terms of this conflict because they're like, oh, well, everybody's just trying to make it a binary. Well, and, you know, for better or worse, there is some kind of a binary at play here, right? On one, you have two sides of a conflict here that are pretty well defined. And personally, what I've seen looking out over the media landscape is there are very few people that I've witnessed, besides yours truly, there are very few people I feel who have done a good job of actually remaining detached from the situation. There's a lot of people out there who will say, oh, I don't support Hamas, but, or I don't support Israel, but. And in some respects, that has to do with the fact that we treat these things like spectator sports, right? Like I was out somewhere and they was like, oh, well, we support Israel in this house. I'm like, well, I'm on America's side. And they say, well, you mean Israel? So Israel's side. And it's like, well, I'm not going to sit here and explain to you what an interesting statement that is. I'm just going to kind of chuckle and say, yeah, sure. I'm not looking for a fight here. It's not this. That's not this is neither the time nor the place. So there's like this. I find it very interesting to point out to you that while there are people who I believe are somewhere in the middle, they still end up falling on one of the two sides of this conflict. And I think that's something inevitable. I think because there's a tendency when things like this happen to support one side versus another. Again, just I've said this a few times now, and I the more I say it, the less irony I have it with. But there was a meme circulating that said something to the extent of the Pope should call for a crusade. That the Pope should call for a crusade, and that the Catholics should take over the Holy Land. And that's kind of funny to think about and historically accurate, we might say. But it occurred to me today that Vatican City is its own sovereign nation. And wouldn't it make a lot of sense if the Vatican City were to annex, let's say, the city of Jerusalem? And given the incentive structure at play, wouldn't then, as a mediator to a historic conflict, wouldn't it be the case that they might actually come to some sort of consensus? Of course, this is presuming that either side in this conflict want a consensus, which, if you listen to the last episode we had, we know isn't the case, right? We have political Judaism fighting against political Islam, and this is a conflict as old as human history. If you want, it has biblical connotations. There's no way to understand this conflict without understanding those pieces. But given that ignorance is bliss, most people won't look for those answers. And most people are already entrenched in an ideology and entrenched on a particular side. And isn't it interesting? This is what I'm pointing out. Isn't it interesting that in American politics, you can openly support either side of this conflict, where in Ukraine, Russia, there was only one side to support? But the rest of us, as I say, are left in a position of uncomfortable apathy. The conflicts breaking out are nothing new. In fact, they are some of the oldest known to man, as I said. Instead of leading the world to a better place, the political class, especially here in the United States, seems content on further robbing Americans to fund all sides of every conflict. And damn you if you think that money should be spent on Americans first. Hawaii had massive wildfires. Supposedly, we have crumbling infrastructure all over this country. People do starve. There are homeless people. And homeless people who actually deserve help, we might say. All of these things going wrong in our country. Retail theft is at its highest levels. In fact, some places have decriminalized the act itself. All of these things are happening. But the best course of action is not to take care of Americans first, but instead to send that money abroad. Why? Well, as I say up here, maybe it comes up here. But as I said, as I'm fond of saying, it's what I should say. The borders a government defends are its external borders. This is all to say, if you've been feeling demoralized and angry about the current state of affairs, whether that means you hate the genocidal Zionists or the genocidal Islamists more, that's the point. Your despair and anger feeds what we call the cult of American democracy and keeps you fighting your neighbor and enriching those who led us to this poisoned well. See, what I've tried to do, and the line of thinking I've tried to cultivate over the last few years in particular, is always to try and stay away from the hot button talking points and to approach these conflicts from a different vector, in the hopes that by doing so, I can lead us to a greater understanding. That's what we're trying to do. And what I've found, and it's funny, I haven't experienced this personally in my life since COVID. If for no other reason than this is one of those, this conflict in the Middle East in particular has been one of those things that has taken over every part of the news cycle, right? You can't really run away from this story the way you can most stories, including some of the stories that we're going to get into later in the show. So we live in this certain mode, right? So the conflict begins and I sit down and I have a conversation with somebody and they say, "Well, you're not on the side of Hamas, are you?" No, I'm just pointing out that the government of Israel effectively controls the area, and if they wanted to, they could have been engaging in some kind of diplomatic thing. Well, but they just want to wipe them off the map. Okay, so what's the solution? Well, they're going to wipe them off the map. We need to turn the entire Arab world into a parking lot for Israel. Okay, so again, we're just having genocidal groups talking to each other. Here's the interesting part. Going back to a point we made earlier in the stream. Our quibbling and talking about this issue, because most of us in this conversation are not close to the levers of power, most of us don't have any kind of real control over what happens. We have the illusion of control in that we can vote and then we can put people in positions of power. We have that illusion of control, but that control, like I said, but it's illusory. It's not physical, it's not proximal. But for some reason, we've been trained to think that if we argue about it, things will get better. That if we gather in the street, things will get better. If we protest and beat each other up, that things will get better. Well, no, that doesn't make things better. But it does serve a purpose. It serves an end. It serves the people in power. We fund every side of every conflict in the United States, right? We send money to the PLA. Yeah, okay, it's not technically Hamas, but money is fungible. We send a lot of money to Israel. They're considered one of our closest allies. And again, we hear, I've got some different stories pulled up here, right? Some different things that we can kind of go through that relate to this issue. But we have, this is what I want to say. We've always had this capacity of dueling narratives in the cult of American democracy. And I think that's part of what makes the system so strong and so resilient. It relies on a premise, a false premise, we might say, that we can unpack at a later time, but it relies on a premise that there can be multiple answers to the same question, which is actually a statement that I would agree with in the abstract. In practice, it generally means that we're following this continual leftward path and conservatives stand athwart history and yell stop, right? In a couple of years, everything gets back to where it was before. In the last episode, I talked about how this is kind of like a hard reset, right? Suddenly everybody's kind of falling back into place to where they're supposed to be. Again, with some sizable dissenters, which is what we should note. Over the course of 20-something years in the terror wars, the West has now imported millions of Muslims, maybe more. I happen to believe that peoples of differing faiths can live somewhat in peace together, provided they live inside a stable society. And unpacking how that society should look is interesting. And if you go to my previous comments about crusades, you might have an idea of where I'm going, at least personally. But there has to be a moral center in a society, and other moral systems can exist within that ecosystem, provided they don't try to take things over. But of course, what we've witnessed, quite chillingly, I would say, honestly, quite chillingly, in some respects, is how much people have taken over. See, a lot of us who have paid close attention to the conflict in Israel and between Gaza and the Western Bank and the resettlements and the general problems, let's just say, the troubles, as foreshadowing talking about Ireland later on. We understand that it's a little more complicated than just thinking that Israel is this beacon of democracy and civilization, and then that the Palestinians are just dirty animals. Because let's be honest, that's what a lot of people believe. And I think in some respects, both sides actually believe that, including the people trying to defend the dirty animals, if you'll pardon my rehashing of that horrible idea to describe fellow humans. A lot of work has been done to make sure you believe that. And really, if you take a step back and you really like it's insane the level of propaganda at play here. And what's fascinating about it is that not a lot of it is coming from the top down of the US, right? But what we're seeing is how these various interest groups can lobby the American people and the sentiment of the American mind, if you will. And like I said, it's inescapable. I drive down the highway, I literally will see one billboard will say Hamas is your problem too. And then the next billboard will say, stop killing children in Gaza. We see it on the television, on the radio, in our social media. And for the people listening at home, a good rule of thumb is the more convincing a random video is, the more you should be skeptical of its purpose. Like I've got a few things here. Like I thought this was interesting. So, there was a lot said about this music festival that was attacked. Now, this is apparently saying that allegedly, and I'm going to say allegedly because who knows? We're not going to know these things for forever. That it was actually Israeli Apaches, people in helicopters that killed a lot of the concert goers, and not Hamas. Here's a fun little video of people people saying how they like seeing dead Israelis and they think it's great. And this is somebody who lives in the US. That doesn't sound very fun. That doesn't sound like the country I want to live in. Here's a video where, this is a legend to show that it was a fake video put out by the Gazans trying to show that they're not actually getting killed. Of course, I've also seen the busted open heads of children. This happened in Uzbek, you might recall, and these things are up on the screen, but if you might recall, it happened in Uzbek. A lot of Muslims stormed an airport and got on a plane and tried to suss out the Jew. Look, I got to tell you, I look at things like this and it doesn't exactly make me excited about the world. But as I said, these conflicts are older than time itself in some cases, right? We can look at like this guy, Yair Lapid. He gave a speech that said, "Oh, well, if you disagree with Israel, then you're really just anti-Semitic and people need to say it." And of course, the United States government itself, or at least the House, they recently passed a bill, didn't they? Stating that that to be anti-Zionist, right, to oppose political Judaism, is to be anti-Semitic, is to actually hate Jewish people. And if I'm being honest, I think some people are actually diving a little too hard into that. Why? Because life is a lot easier if there's an easy enemy to identify. And so for a lot of people, that might be the Jewish people. I don't know. I certainly see the problems of Zionism and its influence. I think if you live in a bad neighborhood and everyone's out to get you, you might think about moving instead of doubling down. But such is the nature of politics and conquering. It tends to be the way of things for humanity. So what's really changed in this conflict? Not a lot. Right? The Biden administration came out and said, ooh, we got a ceasefire. As if that's some grand, it's like, we could stop the war tomorrow. We just say, hey, we're pulling the plug. We're not going to give you your money anymore. But of course, that might then mean that people aren't getting their money in the United States. And this brings up what I think is an important question. Namely, who gets to have an identity? I'll be honest, guys, identity is of great philosophical interest to me for many, many reasons. Chief among them, I guess, is because I've kind of witnessed this firsthand as somebody with something of a unique identity in American politics. This is a tweet, by the way, that I pulled up here that Thomas Massey's getting in trouble for because he's America first. He's a patriot. And Congress these days seems to care more about Zionism. But who gets to have an identity? See, one of the things it's interesting from my perspective that I can bring to this is there's something to be said for the fact, right? Let's set all these other ideas to the side for a moment. There's something to be said for the fact that when something hits close to home, you tend to get emotional, right? In last episode, we talked about Ben Shapiro and how the guy whose facts don't care about your feelings has certainly felt very strongly, very, very, very strongly about how what we might say is the current conflict and Americans' opinions of Jews and Jews' opinions of Arabs and so on and so forth. And it's understandable because he's got family over there, assumably. It's very tied to his culture and who he is as a person. I know a little bit of something about this as somebody of Cuban descent, with the caveat that nobody gives a crap about Cubans in American politics. They just don't. We've become something of a useful voting bloc for people in South Florida. However, they really have it. It's not a consequential country the way it once maybe was. Most people don't know much about Cubans or Cuban food or what Cuban culture was or what Cuban American culture is, blah, 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 blah. And that's okay. I'm not criticizing that. I'm just pointing out that I had this foundational story that I was raised with that most people I met on the street couldn't give two craps about. And much like the Ukraine-Russia conflict, the Israel-Palestine conflict is in many respects an ethnic one. And it is one unique to a certain area, we might say. But most of the people you see on TV and in major, and a lot of the people in media have this close affinity to Israel in particular. And so this thing that's very close to them becomes very important for the rest of us, precisely because they're the ones who tell you and point you in the direction of where you should go. We're going to explore some other areas of instability in the world, and I do think a lot of them actually sent circles around this question of who gets to have an identity. Because the answer for the last 20 to 30 years, certainly in the 21st century with the wars on terror, the West has not been allowed to have their identity. And in fact, to the extent that we can create this image of the West, we're supposed to reject our identity as being awful, colonizing, racist, blah, 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 blah. Crossover here as well from the feminism angle of men and women, but just by and large, you're not supposed to feel good, right? You're supposed to be ashamed of the fact that the school you went to had a Eurocentric view, even though 90% of the people in that school come from a European background. But as America's projection of strength dwindles, and I think that's what we're witnessing. What we've seen, I think one of the reasons for these conflicts, because again, these conflicts are old. Some of them are just as old as time itself. I think that's one of the reasons why we're starting to see these conflicts spring up, because things are changing and the political class has I don't know. It's not that they don't have the incentive. They have no desire to change to suit the times. If you're asking me what they're trying to do, I would say simply they're just trying to make sure that they're at the top of the heap when everything goes to shit. And they're going to take as much money as they can in the meanwhile. I think there are some ideological people, but I still think that most of the people are doing just basically doing what it is. Let's check in with the chat. What's up, Carlos? What's up, Jay? Let's see. Apache helicopters are a product of climate change, I suppose. I am not drinking at the moment. Let's see. Morality doesn't lead to peaceful coexistence. It curbs the worst. Okay, the camera's right there. It curbs the worst to less than worst. No, yeah, but in order for there to be some sort of peaceful coexistence of people, you need a moral thing at the center, I would say. Identity is a byproduct of individualism. Individual is wrong. I don't disagree. I don't agree with that because I think identity stretches out farther than individualism. An individualist identity, where you're always trying to identify yourselves as against your group instead of being a part of it, is the trick of the modern day that's actually led to a lot of problems. Because center right can, Carlos, I'm assuming the center right can do something. I don't know. And then, of course, Jason says there's no center, there's only non-extremes. All depends on how you conceptualize things, guys. But I appreciate y'all hanging out in the chat. Let's see. Okay. So the next story we're going to talk about, and what I've entitled this is Everything Wrong with Narrative-Driven Journalism. You may have seen this story, you may not have. I found it particularly interesting, just in terms of how much was there. And the fun part of this show is the fun part of this show is, given that we're going to sometimes look at things a couple of weeks after they happen, I can actually give you all the facts as they exist. And so this was a story that if you didn't see, now, full disclosure, I am not somebody who sits around and watches football or American football on Sunday. Just not my cup of tea, if you will. But apparently there was, apparently there was a kid at a Kansas City Chiefs game who decided to dress in a headdress and, be at the game. And it looks like he actually got some pictures with the cheerleaders, and, here he is. And, he's just a kid enjoying football. A lot of kids out there enjoy football. Apparently they had good seats too. Now, this kid appears European, he appears white, but of course, child doesn't have to succumb to such ridiculous epithets, and in fact they had no probable interest in that. They just wanted to support the team. And so this guy, Karen J. Phillips, let's take a look at his profile here together. This guy, Karen J. Phillips, oh, his tweets are protected now. That's funny. This guy, the senior writer at Deadspin, the Pulitzer nominee in 2020 and 2019, now has his tweets protected. Why? Well, because he's kind of a piece of crap, and he's kind of an example of everything that's wrong in modern day journalism. And so Deadspin, which, Deadspin got popular kind of in the beginning of the racist thing, and here this little cartoon shows it. They printed this picture, and we saw the kid with face paint here, and you can see clearly he's got the colors of the Chiefs on his face. One side is red, one side is black. But they only did it on the black side. And they posted this guy, Karen J. Phillips, who appears to be in his 40s. And that's really, I understand. We're gonna delve into the narrative things at play here, but there still is a part of me that looks at this and says, how craven, how horrible a person do you have to be that when a child is just trying to enjoy a football game, seeing people on the field, and just let's play into their ridiculous arguments of racism, shall we? Who is there to cheer on mostly black men on the football field in American football, mostly people of color, and to root them on to victory. He's not trying to do anything nefarious. He's not even trying to be ridiculous. He's not even trying to be funny. This is a sincere effort to be part of the team, part of the experience, and to have fun. And people like this guy, People like this Karen J. Phillips, who now has his tweets protected on X, look at that and say, screw that kid. I'm going to turn him into a monster. What a piece of shit, right? We can just leave the story at that, but we're not going to, because we want to talk about the problem of journalism in this country. So here's what we have to understand. They had the picture. If this guy wanted to do, this is what, again, going back to what I said, most journalists are propagandists who are looking for facts to suit their narrative. That's what we're doing. That's what they're doing in this instance. They are not. If they were looking for the story, they would actually have gone and tried to find the kid. It wasn't that difficult. A lot of the internet was able to do it pretty quickly. But this guy, but of course, it's not. It doesn't. They don't need to, because it suits the narrative. And it suits the narrative, but it doesn't matter about the truth, because in some respects, the truth is irrelevant in their perspective. And also, it's irrelevant to the incentive structure that most of these websites have to do, which is to say, getting clicks and driving traffic, right? You know, Deadspin has been a company on the decline. Deadspin's been a company in decline, and now this brought them to the forefront. Here, you can see here the original. You can see here the original thing if you're watching this on YouTube or Rumble. This is what they showed, and said the NFL needs to speak out against blackface. And then he said, well, but he's got black and red, which are the colors of the team. And this guy said, well, I can make an argument that this sounds even worse. Well, of course you can, because you're just putting the facts to suit your structure, the narrative structure. And apparently you have no joy in your life. Of course, forget the next, and you know, like the next big revelation is that this kid is actually from a native tribe in some respect. So like, this wasn't just a headdress. I don't think this was just a headdress that his family picked up at a store. It's probably something in their family. Maybe they picked it up at a store. I don't know. It doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter whether this kid was part of a native tribe or not. Are we really going to look at something like this? Like, you look at something like this, you don't see malice, right? You don't see somebody who is trying to cause offense. You see somebody who's trying to celebrate something. And what's ridiculous about our modern thing, where we have to hate who we are, and so we then is clearly it's an homage. Clearly everything about this is an homage. The same way that the Minnesota Vikings is an homage to the fighting spirit of the Vikings, this is an homage to the fighting spirit of the Native Americans. Because that's what we're trying to do in spectator sports. And again, as I speak this as somebody who's not the biggest, like, I don't live or die by my favorite teams. Love going to a game, but you would never see me. But frankly, you would also never see me done up like this, even as a kid. It's just not who I was. But it's who this kid is, and he was trying to have a good time. And some grown man decided that he was going to make him an example of. And in doing so, he brought a lot of attention to him. Now, a lot of attention he didn't want, it turns out. But hey, it still served his narrative. So what does that say about everything else you see? Because here's the dirty little secret, right? A lot of these people who end up in sports journalism wanted to be in real journalism to begin with. There just tends to be more jobs in sports journalism because there's a lot more sports. And there's an audience for it as well. But a lot of these people were trained in political ideologies, and so they want to bring that to something that, you know, is culturally relevant and influential. And that's why we see a lot of the things we see in regards to that. This next video that we're going to talk about, sticking on the racial angle. This next video is from Ibram X. Kendi. Now, I haven't watched this new documentary that's supposedly on Netflix, but I plan to, maybe. I'm maybe not, because I don't have Netflix anymore, considering they make it difficult to log in with somebody, and I don't want to pay for it. But the headline reads, "Whiteness prevents white people from connecting to humanity." Let's see
with
what he
how
has
much
to
their
say.
own personal identity.
Woo. Hopefully you guys can hear that. It's coming through the wrong speakers. One sec. Is that supposed to be profound? He asks rhetorically. Because that is supposed to be profound. Because in this man's world, people like me are evil. And people like you, anybody who's listening to a show like this, would be evil as well. I don't even think of myself as white, for the record. I know I'm pasty. I know I'm pasty skinned, but I don't think of myself. I've never thought of myself in those terms. It's always been weird to me. Because what the word white really means in some respects is like WASP, which in some respects means Anglo, which means, British, Teutonic, this northern thing. And it's such a complicated, annoying thing that I really don't find the desire to deal with very much anymore. But it's good to check in on stuff like this because, man, this guy can sure spin a yarn. I want to listen back again to the middle part of this where he says, I think it was here. So the case being made, right? We're going to logic this a little bit. The case being made is that the problem with white people who engage in whiteness, which what is whiteness? Whiteness is patriarchal, is a patriarchal order, is a Christian order, is a order in general, is a meritocracy. Meritocracy is whiteness, the idea that the best people for a job should be the ones getting it. Colonialism, which, whatever. That's about as old as humanity itself, and every single race is colonized at one point or another. But he's saying that when you don't see yourself as part of humanity, which is interesting considering that the message of Christianity is that we are all humans together. And so you see the perversion of Christianity within what Ibram X. Kendi is saying. To connect with people who are different than you. Like anybody who grew up in a multi-ethnic area learned how to talk with people that were different than them. I feel personally, I guess I could be wrong about that. But more importantly, people who are open tend to be able to connect with people who are different than them more often than not. See, this is the thing that people like. This is the irony of people like Ibram X. Kendi, who have twisted themselves into these horrible pretzel shapes of ideologies in order to suit a pre-existing narrative that they want to impose on the world. When in reality, a lot of people throughout time have been able to identify with the other, people from other races, other ethnicities, other cultures. And speaking personally, it's something I quite enjoy. I enjoy that my life takes me to places that of different cultures and different ways of doing things. But I also completely respect that there are people out there who hate that. But see, what Ibram X. Kendi, he can only exist within a certain kind of ecosystem, and an ecosystem that purposefully tries to obfuscate the truth from the average person. But hey, I guess good for him for getting a Netflix special, right? That's something we can all agree with, maybe. Our next story is about our friend and some would say savior, some would say antichrist, Elon Musk. And Elon recently told some big time advertisers to F off. Now, this video is the full thing. It's not the clip that went viral, but I'm realizing I have the clip that went viral in my messages, so I can just pull that up real quick for you guys. So Elon Musk was I think so. What's interesting is Elon Musk seems to be all over the place recently, and he said a lot of stuff in terms of a lot of stuff in terms of free speech, in terms of the future of X as a social media platform, formerly Twitter, so on and so forth, right? And a lot of that has to do, one thing to keep in mind is the fact that he's probably out there trying to promote the Cybertruck. Whatever. We're not going to break down the Cybertruck on this show. It's not really my forte, but hey, maybe we can talk to somebody about it. So he sat down for a conversation with the New York Times, and he's had this to say. And of course, this guy has no idea where to take it. I thought a few things were really interesting about this story, right? It's an interesting interview. I listened to the whole thing. But what I want to focus in on here is a narrative, is an angle that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about. And that is the role of advertising in media. Now, just for the sake of transparency, in part because, this show is not in part because it's hopefully people could hear that. If not, Elon says fuck you to Disney. He tells Bob Iger to go fuck himself, and he says he doesn't care if you're going to blackmail him with money that you don't want to. If you're going to blackmail him with money, that he wants you to go fuck yourself, and that's basically implying that that's a ridiculous thing to do. So what I want to talk about is the role of advertising in media. Now, for this show and for this project, my Substack, for many reasons, every year I I think about it, and not that the show makes a lot of money, but hey, if you want to buy me dinner, become a member of the Been Awake Elite. You get full access to the archives, you get special content, you get access to this entire live stream. It's not going to be chopped up into segments for you. And you're buying me dinner. You're showing me that the work I'm doing is worth a little bit of your hard-earned money, and that helps me keep the lights on, helps me pay for things like StreamYard, and helps me stay motivated to keep making content like this for people. But I've decided, because there's small businesses out there that you can get, there's affiliate marketing you can do. There's different ways you can try and earn income online. And I've kind of purposefully decided to use a corporate to use a donation model. Sorry, I'm a little, somebody messaged me and said that they couldn't hear the video, so I'm trying to figure out why that might be happening, but maybe it's just in spaces. I don't know. And I've decided to use a donation model, right? Just leave it at that. But part of the reason for that is, and this isn't a very large show at the moment. It's a very good show, but it's not a very large show. Part of the reason for that is at some point, when you start taking money from advertisers, you start listening to your advertisers. Now, sometimes you can be, if you're really, really good, you'll make sure that only take advertisers that don't care what you say, don't care about the topics you talk about, or advertisers who support your mission, right? Which is something that we see a lot, especially in the political space. But there is a degree to which, when you go that route, which is the route that's how you make money in this game, right? Very few creators, and usually these are people who have proven themselves out over a long period of time. Very few creators can actually support themselves on a donation-only model. It's just the truth, So you supplement things with you supplement your income in different ways. But for the biggest houses, the Daily Wires, the CNNs, the New York Times, the Facebooks of the world, they all rely heavily on advertiser money, funding flowing into their accounts to, earn them a decent profit. And so it seems crazy that somebody like Elon Musk would tell Bob Iger of Disney, who was in that room, he actually spoke. Crazy as it might sound, he actually spoke with the same guy at the same event, to go fuck off. So what does this mean? Well, and what Elon does is he goes on to say that don't do it. X will fail, and people will know that you're the reason why it failed. Right? And I don't even think that X will fail. I think there's I don't know. We'll see what the platform turns into, but I tend to think it's going to survive. A lot of people I know out there bemoan the idea of a culture war and what a culture war means or what it is. I think they exist. I think cultures are always at war with each other. It just depends on what level it's happening at. And I've made multiple references today of the fact that for most Americans, the Bill of Rights is an afterthought, where you would think for the American people that would be at the center of the identity, the center of the core of the being, of the people. Certainly that's how I was raised as an American. Is that things like the First Amendment and the Second and the Fourth and the Fifth and all of the amendments are important to defend our rights as people, as free-born men and women. But we saw in 2020 that nobody cares about that, really. And certainly not the major corporations if it's going to affect their bottom line. What does it really mean for journalism that a platform like X could go under if they don't get funding from major corporations? What does that mean for the cable networks that exist out there? Well, it means they're beholden to their advertisers. And so people should take a close look at who advertises in those spaces. A lot of people, especially towards the end before he was kicked off, and, gosh, if you're not watching Tucker's interviews on X, I'm not sure what you're doing. but you're not paying attention certainly, because they've been off on it. They've been crazy lately. I mean, he just had Alex Jones on him most of the way through that. Very, very interesting to listen to him in a very more of a less polished version of himself. Certainly that. But even towards the end of Tucker Carlson's tenure at Fox News, there was, people were constantly going after his advertisers to try and get him off the air, such that he only had like Mike Lindell from MyPillow and maybe one or two other advertisers on his team. Those are the only people who would advertise with him, and eventually Fox kicked him off. So it matters, because that's how you cash in this world, is through the advertising. And so what does it say that corporations like Disney don't support free speech? Because that's the narrative game at play. Most of us see what Elon's doing as a measure for free speech, which we still think has some necessity in our world. And the other side sees it as enabling racism. How do you come to terms with these divergent viewpoints and divergent ideologies? I don't know that we can. And that's one of the reasons why, when we started this episode, I said we have to leave behind the idea that we can really change things. And you can change you can make your own life better, you can improve your own physical and spiritual conditions, and then in turn have a network effect and positively help the people around you. Right? It's not to say that we're powerless, but it's recognizing what our power can actually accomplish. That's a different calculation for Elon Musk. Elon Musk is somebody who can actually change things. I mean, he literally took Twitter, had it stop responding to every government request, and basically created what can be considered one of the last bastions for social media, for any kind of legitimate, not even legitimate, any kind of freedom on a social media platform. That's the first step. A dispersed ontological social media platform, as opposed to a top-down autocracy that, from what I can see, Meta and Instagram have become. So, of course, advertising influences the decisions of major media corporations, and this just tells us exactly how much it is, because nobody thinks that he can succeed without them, which tells you a lot about them. Next story I want to read to you guys is, it's like, why did it blur? Is about Javier Milei in Argentina, who just won an election. He won the presidency, in fact. Just a few short years ago, I would have been over the moon that an outright libertarian and even a self-professed anarcho-capitalist had won a major election. I had even predicted, I think on this show, or maybe in an interview that I've given, that liberty, as it were, might not be found in the United States next, but might be found elsewhere, especially in countries like Brazil and Argentina. Argentina experienced a boom in the industrial and post-war era, but that was quickly overtaken by socialist policies. South America in particular became a hotbed for an ideological set of thoughts, specifically liberation ideologies. And you'll remember in the video of Kendi we just watched that he talked specifically about liberation. These liberation ideologies had a Marxist leftist perception with a Latin twist, we might say. In particular, one thing that's plagued Argentina for a number of years has been and continues to be a high rate of inflation, monetary inflation, and an unstable currency, which has led to large underground black markets of people holding US dollars because it's a better store of value. I think it's important for us to answer a few questions about this story. An outright libertarian won an election. Why did it work? Well, in part, it worked because he had built a reputation for himself over time. Right? It's my understanding that he played soccer for a bit, he was in music for a bit, then he went and became an economist and kind of been on TV a lot until he decided to run for president and run on a very strict libertarian platform. The ideas of libertarianism are still very foreign to most people, which is one of the reasons why you don't hear me talk about them very much and why I don't think for a country like the United States of America it's a winning message. And I don't even think in particular in Argentina that people cared as much about his ideological commitment as much as they cared about the people he opposed and what he promised to them, which was stability, order, and feeding into that populist narrative of the elites have done us wrong. Will it work? That's yet to be determined. Of course, there are plenty of people out there who reasons we for reasons that I'll detail that they don't seem to want him to succeed, and they mostly don't want him to succeed because of actually what I found in this article here, how Javier Milei will transform Argentina's foreign policy. And this is what I really thought was interesting about an article like this, was a little bit of the substance. Like, it was actually a decent article that Al Jazeera put together, but also what it says about, I think, a certain reflexive anti-American sentiment that does exist within certain libertarian circles. What this article points out is that while Milei will actually have some, say over domestic policy, where he's really going to have the most success at the beginning is in foreign policy, right? And let's see. I want to just this article says there's a few things that's going to change. One is that Argentina is not going to be part of BRICS, which is this rising coalition of an alternative monetary system outside of the petrodollar. Basically, it seems like Milei wants to put himself 100% behind the United States, which if I was advising him, I would tell him not to do. But for most people in Argentina, the dollar is the thing that they hold on to because they think it's going to last longer, and certainly it's going to last longer than the Argentinian dollar. So these are the three shifts. First is reevaluating relations with China. At the end of a visit to China this year, economy minister Sergio Massa, Milei's left-wing rival for the presidency, joked that his country should be renamed Argentina. The quip illustrated the close ties the outgoing government has cultivated with Beijing. In the last half year alone, Argentina joined China's Belt and Road Initiative, an overseas investment program, and expanded a currency swap deal that has helped prop up its economy. China is Argentina's second biggest trading partner and a major investor in its energy and lithium sectors, but Milei's hardline rhetoric could put those relationships in peril. We'll see, because we say a lot of bad things about the Chinese in America, but they still do a lot of business with us. Provoking the Chinese is not a good idea, Ein said. It has consequences. Milei's camp has argued that Argentina can unspool its diplomatic ties with China while avoiding a negative impact on its export industry, but Ein is skeptical. It's an illusion to think you can lack political relations but still have economic relations. He said, in China's case, it doesn't work like that. During a news briefing after Milei's election, the Chinese foreign minister warned Argentina that severing ties would be a serious mistake. And Argentina has already experienced blowback to measures it has taken against China in the past. In 2010, when its government accused China of undercutting anti-dumping rules designed to maintain fair pricing in international trade, China responded by banning the import of soybean oil from Argentina. This article is saying that could potentially happen again with Milei's government. The next one is a full-throated embrace of the U.S. It says here that the predecessor, President Fernandez, was elected in 2019. He came in part of a power of pink tide, a wave of left-wing leaders sweeping across Latin America. Many members of the pink tide rejected U.S. efforts to shape policy in the region, instead seeking alternatives like China to American leadership and economic might. But Milei is expected to break with that trend on the campaign trail. He repeatedly said he would pursue a foreign policy aligned with the U.S. and the rest of the free world. For his part, Milei looks to the U.S. as a pillar of his economic agenda and the the IMF's largest shareholder, and Milei will need its help to get a $44 billion loan program back on track. And the third is a high point of Argentina-Israel relations. Now, this has a lot to do with why a lot of American libertarians don't love where Milei is at. Is that, he's full-throatedly behind Israel. Look, at the end of the day, I think his election is interesting. I think he will necessarily have to mollify some of his more radical positions in order to wield power, because there's still a legislature to get through. So I'm not sure in the end he will help anybody except maybe the Argentinian people. But if he's able to do that, I think that's enough. If you haven't heard, Spain has banned the rosary. I don't blame you if you haven't been keeping up with Spanish politics. It hasn't been a focal point for our media, and in part, this is because it doesn't fit a pre-approved narrative. The socialist government in Spain, though, has made some moves, pardoning Catalan separatists, giving them more power in the Spanish legislature and government. This has caused a backlash from the right half of the country, most prominently the largely Catholic population. In particular interest to me is that they have banned the public praying of the rosary, as many people have been using and praying the rosary peaceably in the street to protest against the moves of the government. Again, this is a sign of the times. People reaching for the reins of power and trying to hold on to the power that they have. And we should keep a close eye on this, because again, this is instability that goes back a long time within culture, within Spanish culture in particular. Next story. Ireland for the Irish? Not really. So this is a little bit about what happened in Ireland recently and why you might have seen the country on fire. So we're just going to read through this article here from Zero Hedge. The trouble began around 1:40 p.m. local time in Parnell East Square in downtown Dublin, next to the Gaelscoil Chocsa Children's School. I think I pronounced that right. The Irish police, or Garda, said 3 young children and a woman in her 30s were wounded by a knife-wielding man in his 40s. 2 were seriously wounded, a 5-year-old girl and the adult woman. The fiend attacked a group of children queued up as they were moving from one scheduled class to the next. The kids were out walking. All of a sudden, one of them fell to the ground, then another fell to the ground. And then another falls to the ground, said a witness. According to some reports, the wounded woman, a school worker, heroically rushed to defend the 5-year-old girl, who was said to have been stabbed in the neck. This all happened in a matter of seconds after her very brave actions. Another 2 children suffered superficial stabbing injuries to the chest and shoulder in what was a frenzied incident. All she was trying to do was protect those little kids and people in a very built-up area in the city center. Update, a delivery driver, ironically an immigrant himself, put an end to the attack. What happened afterwards was the country on. Literally, we're looking at a picture of a burning car here on the screen. A Garda spokesperson said the early indication was the stabbing rampage was not an act of terrorism, and officials have yet to identify the attacker and his ethnicity. I believe now he's been identified as somebody who was an immigrant of 20 years. But basically, this spawned a lot of protests in Ireland because it's believed that this is a result of having a huge migration crisis. And something that I discovered listening to people talk about this story, which I find very interesting, is that most of the low-end hotels, and up to, in fact, like 2- and 3-star hotels, which is mostly what you'd stay at, like a Holiday Inn Express or a Hampton Inn or a Fairfield Inn, a lot of those hotels are actually being taken up by migrants who have come to Ireland, and they're being housed there at the government's dime. Again, let's go back to the question we asked earlier. Who gets to have an identity? What lands get to be for a certain people alone? I think it's a fair question to ask. I don't think, because because we're not dealing with an age of immigration. We're not. There are still plenty of immigrants in this age. There are still plenty of immigrants in this world. However, that's not really the problem that we see, right? In places like Spain and Ireland and Europe and here at home in the United States. No, in fact, what we see is migration, which is something very different. It has very little to do with wanting to reestablish yourself inside of another culture and has far more to do with basic economic gain. Has no migration does not imply assimilation by any stretch of the imagination. And we do wise to remember that. Which is one of the reasons why we're going to talk about immigration after we talk about the GOP debate. Now, I haven't spent a lot of time covering the GOP debates because, frankly, let's all just be honest here as we're sitting around talking. The fact that everybody in these GOP debates are barely running for second place, right? Trump has not been in any of them, and he still leads the field by 20 points. Tells everybody that this isn't real. And it really, to me, brings out what the theater in what we call political theater. And that's one of the reasons why I haven't been paying too much attention, especially because these things always start out with, like, there's 16 people on the stage, most of them don't matter, and it's just we're still so far away from the election, and the polling numbers are so in favor of Trump. There's really no reason to like these things unless you really want to be, unless you just enjoy the spectacle, unless you just enjoy the show. Now, that being said, that's not to say that some people aren't playing the game correctly. And I do think that one of those people who's played the game correctly is Vivek Ramaswamy. Now, I know some libertarians don't like Vivek, and I don't know, and I know I always start from that perspective. It's because it's the perspective that's close in terms of where I was most recently, right? So let's see here. Mute audio screen, unmute audio screen. So we should be getting that. But Vivek's done a very good job. I think he understands that none of this is for first place. And so he's just been taking people like Nikki Haley to task. And frankly, I enjoy it. Now, I know Vivek has said some things that some people don't like, including using the government, using the army to go after the Mexican drug cartels. But like it or not, like I was talking about earlier with Milei's victory, is you have to, no matter what you do, there's coalitions are involved in any kind of government operation. Even like the most autocratic governors throughout history have had advisors and people that they've had to work with. Now, they might have killed those people at some point and then solidified their power, but you understand there's always some form of consensus building in any kind of government. And I would caution people, especially the people who fall victim to every conspiracy out there, that you might be missing the forest for the trees, and you might miss something interesting that happens because you're very comfortable in your ivory tower. So hopefully this is working. Let's all listen together. So that was Vivek taking Nikki Haley to task and saying that the neocons have lied to us. All true, by the way. We got a second one here I want to play that was pretty good as well. Again, hopefully everybody hears this. If it's not there, it's going to suck. It was a great debate. It was a lot of fun. Vivek's making moves. That's about all we need to really take from something like this. You know, nothing's really, again, because Trump's almost definitely going to get the nomination. So what are we doing here? But I think Vivek's positioned himself well for a cabinet position or setting himself up for a future political run. So, like I said, I want to spend a little bit of time here talking about the differences between our the differences between what we see today and what we've seen in the past in terms of immigration. And the thing I want to put in regards to this is immigration or invasion, because a lot of people on the right will talk about the modern immigration as being an invasion. And as I was saying before, and I thought there's a couple of things I wanted to show you here in regards to this, because what's also very interesting about the timing of the attack of Hamas in Israel is that it was starting to go around the time that there's legitimate issues with this migrant crisis occurring, so legitimate that you've seen governors across the country starting to address it, and even the mayor of New York City going to South America to investigate the problem, right? This was what's his face, Eric Adams, went down there very, very recently, like almost right before all the chaos broke out in the Middle East. So it's not really something that people are able to ignore anymore. And I thought this video was interesting. Now you can see a lot of different videos of people here, and we don't really need sound on this, but you can see a lot of different videos of people at the border from various parts of the world. But what you see here are a bunch of people from China, and they all have backpacks, and they're all sitting in a very orderly line, and they're all waiting to be processed because they know they're going to be let into this country. Most of what your average liberal believes about immigration today and the border is false, but they are led by a certain impulse to always accept the other. There's evidence that a lot of the women during these journeys are raped, that children are raped, children die, people bring their children up with them, and it's horrible. And everybody watching this can understand why people would want to come to America. For as hard as we work, for as difficult as things can be here, it's still a better economic condition for the people coming, and it offers a better future for their children. So while Ibram X. Kennedy would think that I can't engage with humanity because I'm white or something like that, I do, in fact, have profound sympathy for a lot of these people, and I understand their story. But what we've seen, but it is worth noting as we look at this, there's only a couple of women coming through. Again, I'm not saying this is representative. This is just one in particular that I found today. There's not a lot of women. And in fact, a lot of these men could be considered of fighting age. Now, does that mean it's an invasion? I guess it depends on what you mean by invasion. I think in a non-literal sense it's true, but in a literal sense it's actually untrue. At least you think that until you hear Dick Durbin talking. It's one half of the immigration equation. So we should recruit undocumented people because military numbers are down. Now, if you didn't know, this is actually something that goes back a long way. A lot of people who are immigrants or who tried to come to this country have traded years of military service to be in the military to themselves gain American citizenship by spending time in the military. So this isn't so crazy. And I guess I'm gonna have to visit this episode on another show a little bit earlier in the context of the conversation, but this is too simple a binary to understand what's going on. And that's why every time I've written about it and every time I've talked about it, I've put it in the frame of human migration in the 21st century. The way human beings in the past migrated for we might say climactic conditions. Today we move for economic ones, and that's something that nobody talks about in the right frame because everybody has a political dog in this fight. So we're moving into our wrap up segment. Got a bunch of videos here that I want to kind of play for you guys. We're going to kind of rapid fire go through them, and then we're going to break for today, and we'll talk about things, I don't know, next time, probably in the new year, maybe at the end of the year. I do want to start doing some shorter segments with stuff that comes up, so I'll have to figure out how to do that. But well, we've got a bunch of stories here, so let's just start through. So this one is Cardi B based. Let's listen to this. Oh, this is a 5-minute video. Never mind. She complains in this video about taxes and that they're going overseas and not going to people here at home. So you thought this was short, Carlos? Well, thanks for still being here, brother. You said this is, I mean, we're an hour 37 in from of a monologue. It's it's tough to keep up steam by yourself, but I appreciate everybody who stayed around and listened. And I do very much enjoy doing these things. So one of the first ones I wanted to talk about here is this 17-second clip from Gavin Newsom completely owning the fact that they did exactly what they did in San Francisco. So a lot of people use this video to bash Newsom. I think it's a brilliant example of how he's able to control a narrative and spin things to his perspective. You know, there was that other video that was going around of him like knocking over a kid and like him kind of like turning it into a wrestling thing and oh how funny. Again, if you right, most people who call themselves journalists are just propagandists looking for facts to suit their narrative, and we as the public are also trained to do that as well. So most of what we think political analysis is just taking facts to suit what we already believe instead of analyzing things for what they are. And I think Gavin Newsom's very savvy. He's very dangerous. And while I might look at a state like California and never want to move there, there are still plenty of people who do. And the way he brazenly owns the fact that, yeah, they cleaned up San Francisco not to help Americans, but because fancy leaders were coming. How do you touch a guy like that? How do you touch a guy like that who says all the right things in the political realm? I thought this story was interesting. This might have slipped in your radar, but two gay men who both attended law school filed a legal complaint against the city of New York, arguing that not having access to a woman's reproductive potential is a form of discrimination and they are entitled to have the city pay for a surrogate. Now, This is an article from 2022, but apparently these two guys are saying that the government should pay for surrogacy. Now, this brings up an interesting question about surrogacy in general, in that it relates to it, speaking frankly, I can understand the impulse for surrogacy, but I think in practice it would benefit people. It would benefit, let's just say, heteronormative gays who still want to raise a family themselves. It would benefit them to maybe go the route of adoption and to convince people of that instead of getting designer babies where you're kind of causing a trauma at the beginning of a child's life. I wanted to highlight this article not to gay bash or not to do anything ridiculous like that, because I thought this was a great example of what I mean when I say that the left is chaos and that leftism is the ideology without limit. Every bond must be broken, we all must be set free, right? That's the idea behind what leftism is. And a story like this reinforces that for us by reminding us that even the most basic bonds of human intimacy, namely that between a mother and his child, must be broken for what? For the sake of progress. You might have seen this video. It's like you have this young girl who, so this poor girl complains about it, and everybody wanted to go out there and say, oh, the Zoomers don't know how to work. But let's be honest, most corporate jobs suck. Then we had Zelensky, Mr. Zelensky coming out and begging the United States for money and basically saying, give us some credit and then we'll make it back. We'll pay you back at the end of the war. Not a great look for a world leader, somebody who's trying to, be the best for democracy. And then I think we're going to end on this one. I got a couple more, but we're just going to end this one. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that this girl was this is definitely kind of funny. And as somebody who just hit 31 and who's very happy to be in a relationship at the moment, and will continue to make sure I can be in that relationship for the rest of my life. I can understand the humor of this, but it does also show some of the problems with modern dating in America. So I thought we might watch it together. Absolutely. Let's not waste our. I'm personally not one for answering unread emails on the weekend, but sometimes I do. So yeah, sure. Let's talk. Love it. Actually something that's great. I wish more women were open about that in the dating world. What do you mean, yikes? That sounds great. Could be fun though. Ouch. That's a euphemism for a penis inside of a vagina. Just a vibe, very uptight. Oh, that's why you're single. Who said that? It was a great movie about Ken taking charge of his life. Oh, well, I don't really like him, but I could easily sound like him if I wanted to. What's very funny, not talk about her ex for the next hour. Eesh, sounds like she's trying to get over somebody. obviously there's an element of humor in that story, but it does speak to something deeper about the issues with modern dating that I've hit on multiple times, namely that for most people there's not a sense of alignment in that regard. And in fact, I do think that the modern feminist impulse to always have a woman striving for independence, part of what's necessary for a relationship is a set of dependence from one person to another. And I've said, and I've covered recently on the show, that the red pill is just a reflection of the feminist space. So they're their own version of messed up, and they have this belief of dominance that I don't think actually comports properly onto human relationships. But wrapping up our thoughts here in the last little bit of the episode, I do think there's an element of that I've learned in terms of being in a relationship recently, is that it is just as much about the dependence of one person on the other. Both people together, not as partners, but as a man and a woman trying to make sense of this crazy, ridiculous world that we all live in. So sorry, guys, I'm trying to cue my outro music and it doesn't want to play. All right, well, that's going to do it for this episode, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it. Do me a favor, go follow me on all social media at the LB Muniz.
If you like what you heard today, go to beenawake.com to subscribe for future updates. My name is LB Muniz, and I am not one with the woke.